The night had started like any other winter night, but the storm came earlier than expected. Thick snow fell from the sky in heavy waves, and the wind pushed against the small wooden cabin as if it wanted to tear it apart. Inside, the man sat near the fire, warming his hands and listening to the quiet crackling of burning wood. He had lived alone in the mountains for years, and storms like this were nothing new. But something about this one felt different. The wind didn't sound normal. It carried a strange echo, a distant hum that reminded him of metal scraping against metal at first. He ignored it, thinking it was just the storm playing tricks on his ears. But then he saw it, the faintest flash of green light outside his window. It wasn't the reflection of his fire, and it wasn't lightning either. It looked like something glowing in the distance, something moving in the middle of the storm. He stood still, watching it flicker once, twice, and then vanish behind a wave of falling snow. Curiosity and worry pushed him to put on his thick coat and boots. He opened the door, and the wind immediately slapped his face with ice-cold air. The snow was already knee-deep, and the visibility was terrible. But that same green glow flashed again, weaker this time, like a signal fading away. He hesitated for a few seconds, asking himself if this was even safe. But the mountains were dangerous in storms. What if someone was stuck out there? What if a traveler needed help? He grabbed a lantern and stepped out into the storm. The cold felt like needles on his skin. Each breath came out as a sharp cloud, and the wind pushed him back with every step. But he kept walking toward the direction of the green light. It appeared again, a little brighter, as if trying to guide him. He moved slowly, forcing himself forward, his boots sinking deeper with every step. The sound he heard earlier soft, unfamiliar grew a little louder. It didn't sound like any animal he knew. It was high-pitched, trembling, almost like a small child crying. His heart began to race. Someone or something was out here. After a few more minutes of fighting through the storm, he saw a shape half buried in the snow. A metal object, broken and twisted, with a glowing crack that pulsed green. It wasn't a snowmobile, and it wasn't a piece of farm equipment. It looked too smooth, too advanced, nothing like anything built on Earth. He approached it carefully, brushing snow off the top. The moment his hand touched the surface, he felt a faint warmth coming from inside, as if the machine had been active only moments ago. Then he heard it again, the small, weak cry. He moved to the other side of the broken pod and froze. Two tiny shapes lay curled up against the metal, shaking violently. They were small, far too small to survive out here alone. Their bodies were covered in shimmering green scales, glowing faintly even through the frost. Their wings were folded tightly, shaking from the cold. Their eyes were only half open, and their breaths came out as little bursts of fog that froze instantly. He had never seen anything like them before. They looked like baby animals, but not from this world. Two tiny dragons, no bigger than newborn pups. For a long moment, he could only stare. His mind tried to make sense of what he was seeing. These creatures weren't natural. They weren't from any forest or mountain he knew. Their colors, their shapes, even their scent, it was all strange. One tried to lift its head, but was too weak, collapsing back into the snow. The other made a soft, pained whimper that cut straight through the cold and hit him, deep in the chest. They were freezing to death. He knew that much instantly. Their bodies were stiff, their wings crusted in ice, and their breathing slow. They wouldn't survive much longer in this storm. He felt a moment of fear. What if their parents came back? What if the pod belonged to creatures far more dangerous? What if touching them put him in danger? But another thought pushed those fears aside. Right now, these babies were dying. If he walked away, there was no question about what would happen. He crouched closer and gently touched one of them. Its scales were ice cold, like touching metal left in the snow. The tiny creature flinched weakly, trying to curl into itself for warmth. That was enough. He couldn't leave them here. Without thinking any further, he took off his thick jacket and wrapped both creatures inside it. They were so light, barely weighing more than a few bags of flour. He held them close to his chest, trying to shield them from the harsh wind. The jacket glowed faintly from their scales, a soft green light shining through the thick fabric dot as he turned back toward his cabin. The storm seemed even stronger than before. The wind howled louder, and the snow fell faster, blinding him as he tried to retrace his steps. Every few seconds, he checked the bundle in his arms, making sure they were still breathing. Their tiny hearts beat rapidly, almost too fast, but at least they were still alive. The walk back felt twice as long. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on him. He didn't know what these creatures were, why they were here, or who had left them in the storm. But he knew one thing for sure. They were innocent. They were helpless. And right now, they needed him. After what felt like hours, he finally saw the faint outline of his cabin through the snow. Relief washed over him. He pushed open the door, bringing a blast of cold wind into the warm room. He quickly closed it behind him and set the lantern down. The fire crackled brightly, filling the cabin with much-needed heat. Carefully, he carried the babies to the rug near the fire and unwrapped the jacket. The creatures lay still for a moment, overwhelmed by the sudden warmth. Their scales glowed a little brighter, and their wings twitched weakly. He grabbed a soft towel and dried off the snow and ice from their tiny bodies. Their skin, where the scales ended, felt softer than he expected, fragile and cold. He moved slowly, afraid that even the smallest mistake might hurt them. One of the babies let out a soft, broken sound, and he gently touched its head to comfort it. The creature leaned into his hand, its eyes closing halfway, as if trusting him already. For the first time, he allowed himself to breathe normally. He still didn't understand what he had found, but at least they were safe now. He placed them on a warm blanket and sat beside them, watching their chests rise and fall. They were still weak, but they were breathing deeper now, not as shallow as before. He thought about the strange pod in the snow, the green glow, the cries that had led him there. Someone had left these babies behind. Someone had abandoned them, knowing they wouldn't survive the storm. As he sat beside the fire, listening to the wind howl outside, he wondered what kind of world they came from, and why anyone would leave such tiny creatures to die in the cold. Whatever the reason, he knew one thing. Tonight, he had saved 2 lives, and his life, whether he realized it yet or not, was about to change forever. The small dragons lay curled on the warm blanket, shivering slightly as the fire's heat reached them. Their tiny bodies were still stiff from the cold, and their breaths came out in quick, frosty puffs. The human watched them carefully, noticing every little movement, every flicker of their wings, every struggle to lift their tiny heads. He had never seen creatures like this before, and the responsibility of keeping them alive weighed heavily on him. He knew that if he made even a small mistake, they might not make it through the night. He moved slowly, reaching for a soft cloth to rub gently over their frozen scales. The warmth of his hands seemed to make a difference. One of the dragons, the slightly smaller one, twitched its wings and let out a weak, almost pitiful squeak. The other opened its eyes a little, revealing bright green irises that shimmered faintly in the firelight. They looked fragile, like tiny leaves trembling in the wind, but there was also a spark of life inside them that refused to go out. The human realized that they were not just creatures, they were babies. Real babies in need of warmth, care, and protection. And for some reason, he felt a deep connection to them, as if he had been chosen to protect them. He searched his cabin quickly, looking for anything that could help. Extra blankets, a small box to make a little nest, anything that could make them feel safe. He lined a wooden crate with the thickest blankets he had, forming a tiny bed for them in the corner of the room. Far from drafts and cold spots, he lifted the smaller dragon carefully and placed it in the crate. The baby immediately curled up, trying to tuck its wings close to its body. The other followed slowly, testing its strength, and finally settled beside its sibling. They were so small, so delicate, that the human felt his heart tighten. He wanted to do more than just keep them warm. He wanted to make sure they felt safe, loved, and cared for. Even if he didn't understand them fully yet, he poured himself a cup of tea and sat near the crate, watching them closely. Their chests rose and fell slowly now, less strained than before. The human took a deep breath, realizing how quiet it was in his cabin compared to the storm outside. Outside, the wind roared and the snow lashed against the windows. But inside, there was warmth, light, and the fragile sound of life slowly returning Dot as the night went on. He thought about what had brought them here. The pod outside had been damaged, abandoned, and left to the mercy of the storm. Whoever had left them clearly did not care if they survived. The thought made him angry, but he pushed it aside. Right now, the only thing that mattered was keeping these babies alive. Questions about their origins, their parents, or why they were left behind could wait. The human knew he had to feed them. He wasn't sure what they ate, but he could see that they were weak and hungry. He carefully offered small pieces of raw meat, soft enough for their tiny mouths. The larger baby took it first, nuzzling the food and licking it gently. The smaller one watched for a moment, then followed, using its tiny claws to hold the piece steady. The human watched them eat, amazed at how delicate and careful they were. Every bite seemed to give them a little more strength. After feeding, he noticed that one of the dragons had a small injury on its wing, a crack in the thin membrane, likely caused by the ice. He felt a pang of worry, but didn't panic. He gently cleaned it with warm water from a cup, using a small cloth to dry it carefully. The baby hissed softly, but didn't resist. He could tell that they trusted him more than anything else in the world at that moment. Hours passed, and the storm continued to rage outside, but inside the cabin, a strange calm settled over them. The human talked to them quietly, telling them everything that came to mind. He spoke about the mountains, about the snow, about small things he had noticed in his life. He didn't know if they could understand, but the sound of his voice seemed to soothe them. Their little eyes followed him, and the larger one even leaned toward him. Nuzzling his hand, the human realized how much work it would take to care for them. They needed warmth, food, and constant attention. Their small bodies were fragile, and their survival depended entirely on him. He felt a sense of determination he had never known before. He couldn't let anything happen to them. Not now, not ever. By early morning, the babies were showing signs of improvement. Their wings were less stiff, their eyes brighter, and their breathing steadier. They even began to move around the crate a little, testing their strength and exploring their small nest. The human smiled, feeling a sense of relief mixed with amazement. These creatures, so alien and unusual, were slowly coming back to life. He spent the entire day observing them, making sure they were comfortable. He adjusted the blankets, built a small barrier to keep drafts away, and even tried making small toys from spare cloth and wood so they could play. They were curious and cautious, sniffing and pawing at anything new. Watching them, he felt something strange and unexplainable bond. These babies depended on him, yes, but he also felt that he depended on them in a way he hadn't realized before. The human noticed a moment of quiet. When both babies rested close to each other, their heads tucked in as they drifted into a light sleep. Their soft breathing, the faint green glow of their scales, and the warmth of the fire created a peaceful scene he couldn't take his eyes off. It was hard to believe that just a day ago they had been on the brink of death, left in the storm to freeze. Now They were alive, resting safely under his care dot. As evening fell, he prepared for another night. He fed them again, made sure the blanket nest was secure, and placed a small lamp near the crate to give them light and extra warmth. He stayed close, not leaving their side, listening to the storm outside and the quiet breathing of the dragons. He realized that his life had changed completely in just one day. These creatures had no home, no one to protect them, and now he had taken that responsibility upon himself. He thought about what this meant. These babies weren't ordinary. They weren't from the forests, lakes, or fields he had known all his life. They were different, unusual, and perhaps dangerous if they grew up in the wild. But that didn't matter right now. What mattered was that they were alive, and he was the reason for it. He felt a quiet pride, mixed with awe and a touch of fear. Caring for these dragons would be difficult, but he couldn't imagine leaving them to face the storm again. Throughout the night, he stayed awake, watching them. Occasionally, one would stir, and he would gently soothe it, making sure it was warm and comfortable. Sometimes he whispered stories of his own life, of the mountains, of his quiet cabin, anything to fill the silence and give them a sense of safety. Their eyes followed him, trusting, curious, and slowly learning that he was not a threat. By morning, the two baby dragons were stronger. Their small movements were more confident, and they were beginning to explore the edges of their nest. The human realized that with time, patience, and care, they could survive, and maybe even thrive. For the first time, he allowed himself to imagine what it would be like to raise them, to watch them grow, and to see the tiny creatures he had rescued transform into something strong and magnificent. He didn't know what the future held, or where these dragons came from. But he knew one thing. He had saved them, and from this moment on, they would never face the storm alone again. Their lives, fragile as they were, depended on him, and he had made a silent promise. He would protect them, care for them, and never let anyone or anything harm them again. The morning sunlight filtered weakly through the thick snow clouds, but inside the cabin, warmth had begun to take over. The humans sat near the fire, watching the two small dragons. They were moving around their little blanket nest, cautiously stretching their wings and sniffing the corners of the crate. Each movement was careful, tentative, as if testing their strength after the near-death experience of the storm. The human felt a mixture of relief and awe. Even in such fragile forms, these creatures carried a quiet power in their movements, a subtle reminder that they were not ordinary beings. He decided that it was time to examine the pod outside again. It was damaged, twisted, and left in the snow without care, but he needed to understand why the babies had been abandoned. Carefully, he bundled the dragons in a thick blanket, holding them close to his chest as he stepped into the cold morning. The wind had died down slightly, but the snow still swirled around him, blurring his vision. He moved slowly, placing one careful foot in front of the other, mindful not to slip. When he reached the pod, the scene became clearer in the daylight. The metal surface was scorched and bent, almost unrecognizable. Frozen snow clung to its edges, and shards of metal jutted out at sharp angles. There were signs of attempts to repair it, but nothing had been finished. The man's eyes caught small, strange markings etched into the metal symbols, unlike anything he had seen before. They were precise, deliberate, and, in a way, cold. It was as if whoever had left the pod had labeled the dragons in some way, maybe marking them as defective or unworthy. He knelt beside the pod and ran his hand over the symbols, trying to understand. The shapes were unfamiliar, but the message felt cruel and uncaring. Someone had abandoned these tiny lives in the storm, not by accident, but intentionally. The human's chest tightened as anger and disbelief mixed with his concern for the dragons. He glanced back at the cabin and thought of the tiny creatures waiting for him, alive now because he had acted when no one else would. The realization struck him hard. These babies had been discarded, left to die for reasons he could not imagine. He carefully returned to the cabin, holding the dragons tightly. Once inside, he placed them back on the blanket nest. They sniffed the air, stretching their small wings, and one of them even attempted to climb onto his lap. The human smiled, feeling a sense of comfort in the trust they placed in him. He knew that they were beginning to bond with him, not just relying on him for warmth and food, but for safety and companionship. It was a responsibility he had never expected to take on, but he embraced it fully. The day stretched on, and he focused on providing for them. He prepared soft meals, cutting small pieces of meat and placing them gently in front of each dragon. The babies ate cautiously at first, still unsure of the human's intentions, but soon their hunger overcame hesitation. Watching them eat, he realized that they were remarkably intelligent. They observed carefully, mimicked his actions, and seemed to understand the basics of eating from the hand of someone they trusted. Each bite gave them more energy, and he noticed their scales beginning to glow slightly brighter, as if reflecting their growing strength. He spent hours observing them, learning their habits and subtle signals. One dragon preferred to stay closer to the heat, while the other seemed more curious about the surroundings. He began to understand their personalities. The smaller one was cautious and timid, while the larger displayed a quiet courage, testing boundaries and exploring new spaces. It amazed him that in such tiny bodies there could already be such distinct character. He talked to them gently, describing the mountains, the forest, and the few animals he had seen in the area. They listened, or at least appeared to, their bright eyes following his movements, their small heads tilting as if absorbing every word as the afternoon passed. He noticed that one dragon had a slight limp when moving. He bent closer to examine it and saw a small injury along its leg, probably from the pod or the storm. He cleaned it carefully, using warm water and a soft cloth, and applied a makeshift bandage. The dragon whimpered softly, but did not resist. He realized that these small beings trusted him completely, relying entirely on his care. The thought made his chest tighten, and he promised himself that he would never let them face danger again, alone by evening. The human decided that the dragons needed more than just food and warmth. They needed enrichment, mental stimulation to keep them growing strong. He gathered small objects from around the cabin, pieces of cloth, twigs, and small wooden blocks. He arranged them in a mini obstacle course near the blanket nest. The dragons approached cautiously at first, sniffing and tapping the objects with their claws. Slowly, they began to interact, nudging, climbing, and even batting at the pieces as if they understood some playful purpose. Their movements became more coordinated, their muscles stronger, and the human felt a deep satisfaction in seeing them thrive under his care. Night fell, and the storm outside had stopped, leaving a heavy layer of snow across the mountains. The human lit the fire brightly, ensuring that the cabin stayed warm throughout the night. He placed the dragons in the blanket nest and stayed close, watching them curl up together. The warmth seemed to relax them completely, and for a brief moment he saw them at peace, free from fear, hunger, or cold. He felt a strange connection, a silent understanding that they were not just animals, they were part of his life now. Fragile yet extraordinary, and he would do everything in his power to protect them. As he sat there, he reflected on the day's events. These creatures had been abandoned, left to die in a cruel, icy storm. Yet here they were alive because someone had acted. The thought weighed heavily on him, filling him with both sorrow for their past suffering and determination for their future. He knew that they were far from ordinary animals. They were different, unusual, and perhaps even magical in ways he could not yet comprehend. But that did not matter. What mattered was that they were safe now, in his care, and would remain so as long as he could protect them, Throughout the night, he stayed awake at times, listening to their soft breaths and the faint rustling of their tiny wings. Occasionally, one would stir, nuzzle him gently, or emit a soft, contented sound. These small interactions, simple as they were, deepened the bond between them. The human realized that the dragons were beginning to trust him fully, relying not just on his protection, but also on his presence and kindness. It was a responsibility unlike any he had known, yet it brought him a quiet joy, a sense of purpose that filled the long hours of his lonely life. By morning, the two dragons were noticeably stronger. Their scales glimmered more vividly, their wings twitched with newfound energy, and their eyes were bright and alert. They explored their surroundings with curiosity, testing the edges of their blanket nest and sniffing the cabin with growing confidence. The human watched them with a sense of pride and amazement, realizing that in just a short time, his care had made a real difference. These babies, once abandoned and on the brink of death, were beginning to thrive. He knew that the journey ahead would be challenging. There were questions about where they came from, why they had been left behind, and what dangers might still lie ahead. Yet he also knew that as long as he was there to protect them, guide them, and care for them, they had a chance at life, a chance they would not have had otherwise. The bond that had formed between them was unspoken but powerful, built on trust, warmth, and the shared experience of survival against the odds. And so, with the dragons resting quietly for a short nap, the human sat back and allowed himself a rare moment of peace. Outside, the mountains were covered in white, silent and vast, but inside, life had returned. The small creatures he had rescued were growing stronger every day, and with them, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. These dragons had survived the storm, and now, under his care, they had a chance to live fully, to grow, and perhaps one day, to show the world what they truly were. Their survival was no longer a matter of luck. It was now a story of care, trust, and the simple courage to act when no one else would. And the human knew, deep in his heart, that this was only the beginning of a journey that would change all their lives forever. The days that followed were different from anything the human had ever experienced. Caring for the two baby dragons had become a full-time task, but one he embraced with a strange joy. They were no longer shivering, no longer trembling from the cold, and their little bodies had begun to show signs of strength. Each morning, he would wake early, checking on them first, feeling their small hearts beat rapidly as they stirred from sleep. The green glow of their scales, now steady and bright, illuminated the corners of the cabin in soft, flickering light. He had noticed how the dragons reacted to him. The smaller one, cautious and quiet, would crawl toward him slowly, sniffing his hands and shoulders, testing whether he could be trusted. The larger one was bolder, more curious, climbing gently onto his lap or nuzzling his chest for warmth. Their interactions were careful at first, full of hesitation, but gradually they had begun to show playful curiosity. Watching them, he realized that these creatures, though alien, were capable of deep emotion, and that he had become their safe place, their guardian. Each day, he focused on helping them regain full strength. He made small meals of soft, tender meat, carefully cutting it into tiny pieces they could manage. He watched as they learned to eat with precision, using their tiny claws and delicate teeth. The process fascinated him. They were learning quickly, and each day brought a small milestone. The larger dragon could now lift its head fully and flap its wings slightly without falling over. The smaller one, though still timid, had started to move around the cabin, testing its legs and claws. Their determination to survive amazed him, and he felt a deep pride that went beyond words. But he also noticed that they were more than just creatures that needed physical care. They had personalities, preferences, and needs beyond mere survival. The smaller dragon liked quiet corners, soft blankets, and gentle touch. The larger one was bold and curious, exploring every object in the cabin, batting at pieces of cloth and sniffing at every sound. He began creating small areas in the cabin where each could explore safely, making miniature climbing obstacles, small nests, and areas where they could rest comfortably. It was work, but watching them interact with their new environment gave him hope that they were growing not just in strength, but in confidence. As they settled into this new life, a bond had begun to form that was unlike anything he had ever experienced. The dragons would follow him around the cabin, chirping softly, nuzzling him when he sat or spoke. He had started to talk to them like they could understand every word, telling them stories of his life in the mountains, of the animals he had encountered, and of the quiet peace of living alone. Sometimes he would catch the smaller dragon tilting its head as if listening intently, and the larger one would rest its chin on his shoulder as he worked. It was a simple connection, but profound in its own way. One day, while he was preparing a meal, he noticed that the larger dragon was becoming restless. It paced around the crate, huffing softly, and flapped its wings more energetically than before. He realized that it wanted to explore beyond the cabin, to see the world outside. The smaller dragon, though hesitant, followed its sibling's lead, watching every move carefully. The human knew that they couldn't stay confined forever. They needed space, fresh air, and an opportunity to test their growing strength. Carefully, he opened the door to the small porch outside. The cold wind hit them, but it was milder than the storm they had survived. The dragons hesitated, stepping cautiously onto the snow-covered wooden planks. The larger one took a small leap forward, landing perfectly, and then looked back at him as if encouraging him to follow. The smaller dragon shuffled slowly, testing the snow before finally moving forward. The human watched them, a mixture of awe and relief in his chest. They were learning to trust him completely, not just for warmth and protection, but for guidance. Over the next few days, he allowed them to spend short periods outside under his watchful eye. The dragons explored the snow, their claws leaving delicate tracks, their small wings flapping against the cold air. They chirped softly, a sound that was new, almost musical, and it warmed him in ways he could not describe. He laughed quietly as they rolled in the snow, chasing each other in small circles, and occasionally one would stumble and fall, only to be righted gently by the other or by him. These moments, full of life and curiosity, made the danger they had faced in the storm feel even more distant. But it wasn't just about play. He had noticed the signs of their alien nature, the way their bodies glowed faintly in response to heat, how their eyes reflected light differently from any animal he had known, and how their small hisses and chirps seemed to carry meaning. He realized he needed to learn more about them, to understand their needs, behaviors, and limits. He spent hours observing them, taking notes in a small notebook, sketching the shapes of their wings and the way they moved. It felt strange, as though he were documenting a secret species, one that no human had ever studied. The dragons responded to this attention, seeming to recognize his intent. They allowed him to examine their wings, their claws, and even their small horns without resistance. Their trust was evident, and in turn, he grew more confident in caring for them. He realized that trust was the foundation of everything. Without it, they would never survive, and without his careful attention, they would never grow strong enough to face the world. One evening, while the fire crackled and snow drifted softly outside, he noticed the dragons leaning against him, curling into his lap and shoulders. Their trust and affection were unmistakable, and he felt an overwhelming sense of connection. It was clear that they had formed a bond not just with him as a protector, but as a figure of comfort and stability. Their small bodies, once trembling and frail, now exuded warmth and energy. Yet they still sought his presence. As days turned into weeks, their behaviors became more complex. The dragons began communicating with each other in small, subtle ways. A soft nudge, a tiny hiss, a flap of wings, each action carried meaning, and he quickly learned to interpret these signs. The smaller dragon often looked to its sibling for reassurance, while the larger one appeared to take on a protective role. Watching them, he felt a deep understanding of family, of bond, and of instinct that transcended species. He also started to notice how intelligent they were. They were learning from him, mimicking actions, responding to his words, and even showing signs of problem-solving. A small food puzzle he made from twigs and cloth was solved by the larger dragon within minutes, who then taught the smaller one how to retrieve the piece of meat. Their cooperation amazed him, revealing that even in their tiny, fragile forms, they carried the potential for greatness. Night after night, he stayed close, ensuring they were safe and comfortable. Sometimes he whispered to them, telling stories of survival, courage, and hope. The dragons would listen, eyes half closed, occasionally nudging him with tiny snouts. The warmth, the trust, and the growing companionship created a strange but comforting rhythm in his life. He realized that saving them had changed him as much as it had changed them. His life was no longer solitary. It was shared, full of responsibility, connection, and an unspoken promise to protect these fragile beings. One day, while he was tidying the cabin, he noticed the dragons responding differently to the light. Their green glow shifted slightly, more vibrant when near warmth and dimmer when in cooler areas. It reminded him that these creatures were not entirely like anything else he had ever known. He marveled at their biology, their resilience, and the way they were learning to adapt to their new environment. He began thinking about their future, how he would continue to care for them, how they might grow, and what challenges awaited them outside the cabin walls. By evening, the dragons had become a constant presence in his life. They explored, played, rested, and learned under his careful watch. He realized that his life had changed completely. No longer was he alone. He was a caretaker, a teacher, and a guardian. Their survival depended on him, and in return, they gave him companionship, purpose, and a connection unlike anything he had experienced before. Though he didn't yet know where they had come from or why they had been abandoned. He knew one thing clearly: they were thriving under his care. The bond between them had grown unbreakable, built on trust, warmth, and the shared experience of survival. He understood that they were more than just rescued creatures. They were family, in their own strange, alien way. And so, as the night fell and the fire flickered softly, he sat close to them, feeling their small bodies curl against him. They were safe, fed, and warm. They trusted him completely, and he knew he would protect them no matter what dangers or mysteries the world might hold. The journey ahead would be long and uncertain, but for now, in the quiet of the cabin, there was life, hope, and a bond that could not be broken. The days passed quietly at first, but one late afternoon, something unusual happened. The human had been outside clearing the small area in front of his cabin to make it safer for the dragons to explore. The snow was still deep in the mountains, but the sun had started to shine weakly through the clouds, and the air felt slightly warmer. The dragons followed him closely, curious about every movement, sniffing the snow and testing their growing strength. Suddenly, a sharp flash of light appeared in the sky, brighter than any sunlight or reflection he had seen before. It moved quickly, descending toward the cabin with a strange hum that made his chest tighten. The dragons froze, their bodies tensing, wings slightly flaring as they hissed softly. The human felt a jolt of fear as he watched the object land a short distance from the cabin. The snow beneath it melted instantly from the heat it radiated, and when he could finally make out its shape, he realized it was some kind of spacecraft. It was smooth, metallic, and unlike anything built on Earth. Strange symbols etched across its surface glowed faintly green, the same color as the baby dragon's scales. His mind raced. Could it be the creature's parents or worse, the ones who had abandoned them? From the spacecraft, figures emerged tall, thin beings with sharp features, moving with precise, deliberate steps. Their eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, and their expressions were cold, almost indifferent. The human's first instinct was to protect the dragons, to hide them or run, but he knew that with the creature's strength still developing, fleeing would be dangerous. Instead, he stood firm, positioning himself between the spacecraft and the dragons. His chest tight with determination, the larger dragon stepped forward slightly, its tiny wings flaring, while the smaller one pressed close to the human's legs. It was clear they recognized the threat, even without understanding exactly who these visitors were. The human spoke softly to the dragons, encouraging them to stay calm, though his own heart was racing. The aliens advanced slowly, scanning the area, their eyes briefly settling on the dragons. It became painfully clear. They were not here to rescue them. The expressionless faces and measured movements left no doubt they were here to reclaim what they considered property. The human took a deep breath and stepped slightly forward, raising a hand as a gesture of defense. "These babies are not yours to take," he said firmly, though he didn't know if they could understand him. The aliens paused, tilting their heads, seemingly surprised by his confidence. One of them raised a thin arm and made a motion toward the dragons, but the creatures hissed and stepped closer to him, nuzzling his legs and flaring their tiny wings defensively. It was a small display, but enough to show that they were united with him, not the visitors. The human realized that the dragon's trust in him was stronger than any fear the aliens might inspire. He felt a surge of courage he had never known before. "You left them to die once," he said, voice trembling but firm. "I won't let you do it again. Not now. Not ever." The aliens remained silent, but the moment stretched, heavy with tension. The dragons moved subtly, their bodies low to the ground but tense, ready to react if needed. Then, something unexpected happened. The aliens tilted their heads again, as if studying the creatures. The human noticed that they seemed confused, not at his words, but at the sight of the dragons themselves. Their tiny bodies were healthy, warm, and alert. Their scales shimmered in the light of the setting sun, and their eyes followed him as he moved. The human realized with a jolt. The aliens had never expected the babies to survive, never thought they could thrive after being abandoned in the storm. Their expressions, though difficult to read, softened slightly, betraying surprise, and perhaps even something approaching respect. The human continued to speak softly to the dragons, guiding them to huddle closer to him. The smaller dragon pressed against his legs, the larger one resting a tiny head on his arm, and he felt their trust like a tangible shield. The aliens seemed to hesitate, their rigid postures faltering as they observed the scene. The human understood then that the dragon's survival, and their obvious well-being, was challenging the aliens' assumptions about what they had considered disposable. Time passed slowly. The human remained steadfast, unwilling to back down. He kept talking to the dragons, reassuring them and giving them courage. The aliens moved slightly, then paused again. They were examining the dragons with careful attention, their heads tilting, eyes narrowing. The human saw something strange, a hint of uncertainty, a crack in their indifference. Perhaps they were realizing, for the first time, that these babies were more than mere specimens. Finally, after what felt like hours, the aliens made a decision. They stepped back, glancing at each other, and then lifted themselves into the air, returning to their spacecraft. The engines hummed, and the ship rose slowly, leaving the mountains silent once again. The human breathed a long, shaky sigh, his chest still tight from fear and relief. He looked down at the dragons. They were alert, eyes bright, and huddled close to him, safe once more. The moment had tested all of them, and they had endured it together, After the aliens departed, he realized the true depth of their bond. The dragons had not only survived the storm and abandonment, they had faced beings from their own world, beings who had given up on them entirely and had chosen to stay with him. The trust and reliance they placed in him had become unbreakable. He stroked their tiny heads, whispering softly, "You're safe now. I won't let anyone take you from me." The rest of the evening was quiet but tense. He kept the dragons close, ensuring they felt protected. He fed them, cleaned their small bodies, and made sure they were warm. Every now and then he glanced at the sky, expecting the aliens to return, but they did not. Instead, the mountains returned to their peaceful silence, and the dragons gradually relaxed, curling into the warmth of his lap. That night, the human realized that caring for these creatures went beyond warmth and food. It was about trust, courage, and the ability to stand up for those who could not defend themselves. The dragons' lives were fragile, but their spirits were strong. Their survival depended not just on physical care, but on someone willing to act with determination. Even when faced with beings far more powerful than he was, he watched them sleep, tiny bodies rising and falling with steady breaths. Their trust in him had been tested, and they had chosen him. The human felt a quiet pride and responsibility unlike anything he had ever known. He understood that their story was far from over. There would be more challenges, more questions, and more dangers, but he also knew that together they could face anything. By morning, the dragons were restless, exploring the cabin with renewed curiosity. Their eyes sparkled with energy, and their movements were confident. The human smiled, realizing that each day brought new growth, new lessons, and new connections. The aliens had returned briefly, but in doing so, they had unintentionally strengthened the bond between him and the dragons. The creatures had survived not just the storm and abandonment, but also the threat from their own kind. They were resilient, courageous, and full of life. The humans spent the day continuing their care. He made small obstacles for them to explore, fed them carefully, and encouraged their play. Each movement, each flap of wings, each tiny chirp reminded him how extraordinary these creatures were. He felt honored to be their protector, their friend, and their guide. As evening approached, he reflected on the events of the past days. From the storm to their rescue, from abandonment to the confrontation with the aliens, the dragons had become part of his life in ways he could never have imagined. Their survival had required courage, patience, and care, and the bond between them had grown stronger with every passing moment. He realized that the journey ahead would be long and uncertain, but he was ready. The dragons depended on him, and he would not fail them. And so, as the fire burned and the snow drifted softly outside, the human held the dragons close. Their small bodies rested against his chest, warm and content. He whispered softly, promising them safety, protection, and care. The aliens might return someday, but for now, they were together, stronger than ever, and ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The days after the alien encounter were quiet but full of meaning. The human had grown used to the small routines of caring for the dragons, yet he knew life could change in an instant. The mountains around his cabin were peaceful, blanketed in snow, yet he remained alert. He had seen firsthand that the dragon's world was far different from his own, and that other beings, perhaps as cold and indifferent as those who had abandoned the babies, might appear again. Still, the bond he shared with them had grown too strong for fear alone to control him. Each morning, he would wake early, the dragons already stirring in their nest. The smaller one would crawl over gently, nudging his hand, while the larger one would flap its wings softly, testing the limits of its growing strength. Watching them, he realized just how far they had come. Their scales shone brighter than ever, their claws were stronger, and their eyes glimmered with intelligence and curiosity. They were no longer helpless infants. They were learning, exploring, and slowly beginning to understand the world around them. He spent the days continuing their care. But now, he added more than just warmth and food. He wanted to teach them about trust, about patience, and about safety. He guided them outside for short periods, letting them explore the snow and the small areas around the cabin. The larger dragon would bound across the snow, wings flapping gently, occasionally glancing back to ensure he was watching. The smaller one, though cautious, followed, testing its strength carefully. He watched them, amazed by their resilience and determination. Even in such tiny, fragile forms, they carried the spirit of survival and a quiet courage that left him in awe. One afternoon, while they were playing near the edge of the forest, he noticed the dragons reacting to a faint sound. It was distant, almost imperceptible, yet they stiffened and tilted their heads toward the mountains. The human felt his pulse quicken. Could it be the aliens returning? He stayed calm, calling the dragons closer. The larger one hesitated, glancing at him, but then obeyed, moving back to his side. The smaller one followed, huddling against his legs. It was in that moment he understood the depth of their trust. They relied on him not just for protection, but for guidance, for reassurance that the unknown was not immediately dangerous as the sun began to set. Casting long shadows across the snow, the human returned to the cabin with the dragons. He prepared a warm meal and settled them near the fire. He spoke to them quietly, explaining the importance of being alert while also enjoying the safety of home. The dragons responded in small ways, soft chirps, gentle nuzzles, and occasional playful flicks of their wings. These moments of communication, simple but meaningful, reminded him that life was now shared. Their presence had changed him, filled his days with purpose and care, and even brought a strange kind of joy he had never known. Night came, and the mountains fell silent under a thick blanket of snow. The humans stayed awake for a while, keeping watch over the dragons as they slept, their small bodies curled together, warm and safe. He reflected on everything that had happened, from the storm that had nearly killed them, to their first moments in his care, to the terrifying encounter with the aliens who had once abandoned them. Each memory strengthened his resolve. No matter what came next, he would protect them. Over the following weeks, the dragons grew stronger each day. Their wings grew larger, claws sharper, and their small, timid movements gave way to confident, playful leaps. The human created small challenges for them, encouraging their coordination and testing their abilities. The larger dragon would flap its wings and try small jumps across the snow-covered ground, while the smaller one would mimic cautiously, slowly gaining skill and confidence. Watching them learn and grow brought him endless fascination and pride. Despite their progress, he knew their safety was still fragile. He kept a close watch for any sign of danger. Occasionally, he noticed strange lights in the distance or unusual sounds from the mountains, and he would guide the dragons back toward the cabin. They had survived storms, neglect, and even alien interference once, but he knew the world could be unpredictable. His role had expanded beyond caretaker. He had become protector, teacher, and friend all at once. The dragons' personalities continued to develop. The larger one was adventurous, exploring every corner of the cabin and the area outside, often returning with small bits of snow or twigs in its claws. The smaller one remained cautious, preferring the warmth of blankets and the steady presence of the human, yet it was learning to test boundaries, following its sibling with curiosity. Their differences were complementary, one's boldness balanced by the other's carefulness, and together they created a rhythm of life that filled the cabin with energy and warmth. One evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, the human noticed something extraordinary. The dragon's scales shimmered more brightly than ever before, reflecting the fading light in a vivid display of green hues. They moved closer to him, curling into his lap and chest, their small bodies radiating warmth and trust. He realized that these creatures, once abandoned and left to die, had not only survived, but had flourished in his care. Their glow, their vitality, and their connection to him were proof of resilience, trust, and the impact of compassion. The human understood that their journey together had created a bond that could never be broken. The dragons had come to rely on him, not out of fear, but out of trust and love. He, in turn, had become more than a caretaker. He was a constant in their lives, a source of safety, warmth, and guidance. He had watched them grow from fragile, freezing infants into confident, curious beings capable of facing the world around them. Days turned into weeks, and the dragon's abilities became more apparent. The larger one experimented with short flights inside the cabin, flapping its wings and lifting briefly before landing again. The smaller one followed cautiously, learning the same movements, gradually gaining strength and confidence. Each success brought joy to the human, reinforcing the sense of achievement and connection they shared. Their progress was a testament to patience, care, and trust. One afternoon, while the human was outside chopping firewood, he noticed the dragons exploring the surrounding area on their own. The larger one leapt onto a snow-covered rock, wings flaring, while the smaller one tested its legs, eventually joining its sibling. He watched them from a distance, ensuring they were safe, and realized how much they had grown. They were no longer entirely dependent on him. They were learning, adapting, and thriving, but they still sought his guidance and protection. As night fell, he called them back to the cabin. They returned quickly, nuzzling against him as they entered the warmth. He prepared their meal, watched them eat, and then sat near the fire, reflecting on their journey. From near death in the storm to abandonment, alien threats, and now growth and safety, their story had been extraordinary. And yet, it was not just their story, it was his as well. Their lives had transformed his, giving him purpose, connection, and a sense of responsibility he had never experienced before. Finally, one evening, as the fire crackled and the snow fell gently outside, the human held the dragons close. Their small bodies rested against him, warm and trusting, and he felt an overwhelming sense of completion. They had survived storms, neglect, and danger. They had thrived in his care, their trust in him unbreakable. He whispered softly to them, promising continued protection and love. The world outside might hold challenges, but within this cabin, they were safe, cherished, and free to grow. The dragons had been abandoned once, left to face the storm alone. But now they had a home, a protector, and a life filled with warmth, care, and trust. Their journey had been long and difficult, yet it had forged a bond stronger than anything the human had ever known. In return, they had given him something extraordinary, as well, the knowledge that compassion, courage, and trust could transform lives. Together, they had survived, grown, and found something far more important than mere survival: connection, family, and hope. And as the night deepened, with the mountains silent and the snow settling softly outside, the human held the dragons close, feeling their warmth and the steady rhythm of their breathing. They were safe, thriving, and together. The storms and dangers of the past no longer held power over them. Their story was one of survival, love, and trust, and it had only just begun. From that day forward, they would face the world side by side, bound not by blood, but by the unbreakable bond of care, courage, and the simple truth that no life, no matter how small or unusual, should ever be abandoned.